I had never refused my family anything, so when I learned that my daughter-in-law had suffered an accident in the operating room and begged me to return and donate blood to save her, I didn't hesitate. I boarded an emergency flight across continents, abandoning the important trip I had long been planning. But the first thing that struck my eyes when I came home was not the image of my daughter-in-law in pain. It was her wicked smile while she lay in my own bed, next to the very husband who had stood by my side for 40 years. What cut deeper was the bitter truth. I was the one who had brought her into this house. To know how my journey of reclaiming myself unfolds, stay with me until the end of this video. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, like and share this video, and leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from. My story will surely shock and surprise you. I am Scarlett, 64 years old, co-founder of a luxury travel company that I built with my husband Aidan, who is 65. 6 months ago, we took a short break to Colorado. It was supposed to be nothing more than a quiet getaway, a time to sit by the mountains and soak in the natural springs we had loved since our younger years. On the second evening, as I stepped into the steaming pool at the resort spa, I noticed a young woman already there. She smiled warmly at me and introduced herself as Riley. There was nothing pretentious about her at first glance. She carried herself with a gentle charm, her words soft and measured. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did, it was often to compliment me in ways that felt both flattering and disarming. She said she admired the way I carried myself with dignity, that I seemed like a woman who had lived with wisdom and strength. I will admit, the words touched me. At my age, it is not often that younger people take the time to notice the years of experience etched on our faces and in our voices. Over the next days, Riley and I spoke often. She sought me out at breakfast, asked me about my travels, my business, my family. I told her about Ryder, my 30-year-old son, who had spent so much time building his career that I feared he might never find a woman who would truly care for him. Riley tilted her head, smiled with the sweetness of someone who seemed to understand. She told me family was everything to her, that she valued loyalty above all. I remember feeling a quiet relief, as though life had sent me a sign at just the right moment. When Aidan joined us at dinner one night, Riley impressed him as well. She spoke with confidence but never overstepped. She praised the company we had built, asked thoughtful questions, and laughed at his old stories. Even he admitted later that evening that Riley had a rare way of making people feel at ease. I carried her words with me to bed, and for the first time in a long while I thought perhaps Ryder's lonely evenings might soon come to an end. On the final morning of our stay, as I packed my bags, I looked out the window and saw Riley waving from the garden. Something in me felt sure. I introduced her to Ryder not long after we returned home. I told him she was kind, genuine, and steady, a woman worth knowing. He listened with more interest than I had expected, and before long the two of them were inseparable. At the time, I believed I had done something good for my family. I believed I had placed in his path the woman who could finally share his life. Ryder fell for Riley faster than I could have imagined. It was as if her sweetness, her soft voice, and her fragile appearance had opened a door in him that had been locked for years. My son had always been driven, focused on building his career, rarely giving time to women or romance. Yet with Riley, everything shifted. He called me one evening after a dinner date, his voice lighter than I had heard in years, telling me how gentle she was, how she laughed at his jokes, how she looked at him as if he were the center of her world. A part of me felt relieved. I thought finally, Ryder had found someone who could soften his sharp edges. Within just a few months, their relationship grew serious. Riley visited the house often, always polite, always ready with small gestures of kindness. She brought me flowers, asked for my advice in cooking or household traditions, and acted as though she truly wished to be part of our family. I told Aidan that I believed this was meant to be, that Ryder had been blessed to meet her, and even he admitted that Riley seemed like a rare kind of young woman. The wedding came sooner than anyone expected. They insisted they did not want to wait, that life felt too short to waste time. So the mansion was prepared for a grand celebration. The garden was filled with roses, the ballroom decorated with chandeliers and gold-trimmed tables. Family and friends from across the country arrived, curious to meet the woman who had stolen Ryder's heart so quickly. I walked through the rooms on the morning of the wedding and felt a swelling pride. Everything sparkled, and so did I, for I believed I had guided my son to his happiness. During the ceremony, I could not keep my eyes off Ryder. His smile was wide and full of hope. Riley walked down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk, her steps measured and graceful. When their hands joined, I felt tears burning in my eyes. As the vows were spoken, I whispered silently that my role as a mother had been fulfilled. I had given my son the family he longed for, and I had given him a partner who would love him the way I had prayed someone would. At the reception, Riley was quick to take my hand in front of relatives and call me her second mother. Her words drew gasps and applause, and I felt my heart open further toward her. In that moment, I believed I had not only gained a daughter-in-law, but another daughter. I carried that thought with me through the night, unaware that what looked like a blessing would later reveal itself to be the seed of betrayal. It was my suggestion that Riley should join the company Aidan and I had built from nothing. I believed she had the charm, the discipline, and the fresh energy that could carry our legacy forward. When I told Ryder of the idea, he smiled proudly, convinced that his wife was capable of anything. So Riley began working at our headquarters, not in some minor role, but as part of the development team where new projects were born. I introduced her to our staff, assuring them she was eager to learn and contribute. At first, Riley seemed everything I had hoped for. She arrived early, stayed late, and always carried a notebook filled with neat handwriting. I would walk by her office and find her poring over reports, asking questions about clients, or studying itineraries with unusual focus. When employees praised her, I felt a quiet pride. They told me she brought new energy into the office, that her smile and enthusiasm lifted the atmosphere. I remember thinking how lucky Ryder was, and how lucky I was too to have chosen her. She began offering suggestions that seemed harmless but creative. She proposed updating our marketing with younger voices, refreshing brochures with modern colors, and reaching out to influencers who could make luxury travel appeal to a new generation. At meetings, she spoke with just the right balance of humility and confidence, presenting her thoughts as if she only wished to support us. The younger staff adored her. They whispered that Riley was different from other executives, that she worked like one of them rather than above them. Every time I heard this, I felt more reassured. I wanted someone who would carry the company after Aidan and I stepped away, someone who understood not only the business but the family that created it. Riley seemed to fit that image perfectly. I told myself she was not only a devoted wife to Ryder, but also a promising partner in our legacy. I even allowed myself to imagine handing over the keys of the company one day, knowing she would safeguard what we had worked so hard to build. Looking back, those early days feel almost like a dream. I see her now in memory, sitting with papers spread across her desk, hair tied neatly back, nodding as she scribbled notes. I see myself smiling with quiet pride, believing I had chosen wisely, believing that fortune had blessed me twice, first with a son and then with the woman who would stand beside him. It is painful now to admit how blind I was, how willingly I let her charm erase the doubts that should have been louder. At the time, though, all I saw was a future secure in her hands. It started with small things, the kind of details one might overlook if not paying close attention. Riley began spending long hours in the boardroom with Aidan, insisting she wanted to learn directly from him how to manage the company's bigger responsibilities. At first, I was proud of her initiative. I thought it showed determination and respect for the knowledge Aidan had gathered over decades. But as days turned into weeks, the pattern grew harder to ignore. She seemed less focused on her own assignments and more invested in shadowing my husband. Soon, Riley was accompanying Aidan on business trips. She explained to me that she needed to gain experience in negotiations and client relations, and that being with him was the best way to learn. The destinations raised my eyebrows. Aspen, Napa Valley, even a seaside resort in Florida. These were places known less for corporate meetings and more for luxury escapes. Whenever I asked about the outcomes of these trips, the answers were vague. She spoke in general terms about potential partnerships, but never produced detailed reports or contracts. I told myself not to judge too quickly. Still, a quiet unease began to stir in me. The whispers reached me slowly. A trusted employee pulled me aside one afternoon and hesitated before speaking. She said people in the office were starting to notice how often Riley and Aiden disappeared together, how their conversations seemed too personal for a professional setting. Another confided that she had seen Riley laughing with him behind closed doors when no meetings were scheduled. These comments unsettled me, though I tried to brush them away. It felt disloyal to question my own husband and the daughter-in-law I had chosen for our family. I spent evenings convincing myself that Riley's closeness with Aiden was only ambition, that she wished to prove herself worthy of one day carrying the company. Perhaps Aiden, feeling flattered by her attention, allowed her more access than was wise. I told myself that I was imagining things, that gossip was dangerous and unfair, yet the knot in my stomach did not ease. Each night when Aiden came home later than usual, with the faintest smell of wine clinging to his jacket, I lay awake and wondered. In those moments, I wanted desperately to believe I had not made a terrible mistake. I wanted to believe Riley was the devoted wife and the promising leader I thought she was, but something deep inside me, that instinct only years of marriage and motherhood can sharpen, began to whisper a warning. I chose silence for the time being, but the doubt had already taken root. It was not just Riley who unsettled me. It was Aiden, too. My husband, the man I had trusted beside me for 40 years, began to change in ways I could not explain. He came home later and later, always with the excuse of meetings that had run too long. He avoided my eyes when I asked simple questions about his day, answering with clipped phrases before retreating into silence. At the dinner table, he seemed distracted, sometimes staring at his phone as if waiting for a message he could not share. I tried to ignore it, but the unease grew until it pressed on my chest every night. Around the same time, the company's financial reports began to trouble me. Numbers that had always been steady now showed gaps. Funds from the corporate account seemed to vanish without clear explanation. Projects that should have been profitable ended with losses. I asked our accounting department for clarification, but their answers felt rehearsed, as if someone had warned them not to dig too deeply. My instincts told me this was not simple mismanagement. Someone was draining us deliberately. One evening, I stayed late in the office after everyone else had gone home. I unlocked the cabinet where sensitive files were kept, and I leafed through the contracts waiting to be archived. My hands shook when I saw Aiden's signature scrawled across documents that sold properties at prices far below market value. On other papers, clauses had been added that handed controlling interest to outside investors I had never heard of. Each discovery felt like a stone dropped into my stomach. The man who had built this empire with me was signing away its foundations. The hardest part was knowing I could not yet confront him. If I demanded answers, he would deny them. If I accused Riley, she would put on her mask of innocence and Ryder would defend her blindly. So I kept the knowledge to myself. I copied the documents quietly, storing them in a safe place where no one but me could reach. Every time I looked at those pages, the ink seemed darker, as though mocking my silence. My instincts grew sharper with every passing day. Something inside me whispered that Aiden's betrayal was not his alone. Riley's shadow lingered over every detail, as if she were the ghost in our house, unseen but always present. I remembered her charm at the resort, her eager smile, her clever flattery. I remembered how I had opened the door for her. Now I began to realize I had invited not just a daughter-in-law, but a danger into my home. I knew better than to rush into confrontation. Years of building a business had taught me that battles are not won by shouting first, but by knowing more than your opponent. So instead of demanding answers from Aiden or Riley, I reached for a quieter kind of weapon. I hired a licensed private investigator in California, a man whose reputation was built on patience and discretion. I told him only what was necessary, and his eyes sharpened as though he already understood that what I feared most was betrayal within my own family. At the same time, I confided in a single person inside the company, a senior accountant who had worked with me for over 2 decades. She was loyal, meticulous, and understood that numbers never lie. I asked her to keep watch on the flow of money, to note any strange withdrawals, unexplained transfers, or accounts suddenly emptied. She agreed without hesitation, and I felt a measure of comfort knowing that someone I trusted was guarding the lifeblood of the company. The first reports from the investigator arrived sooner than I expected. He delivered photographs of Riley and Aiden, not in meeting rooms with clients, but in the dim light of restaurants where couples dined by candlelight. There were pictures of them entering hotels late at night, dressed as if for leisure, not for business. In one image, Riley's hand brushed Aiden's arm in a way no daughter-in-law should ever touch a father-in-law. My heart clenched as I studied the prints, each one stabbing deeper than the last. Yet, I remained silent. I placed the photographs in a locked drawer in my study, next to the copies of contracts I had already gathered. I told no one, not even Ryder, who would have defended Riley without a thought. Instead, I waited, letting the pieces accumulate until they formed something undeniable. I had learned long ago that truth, once complete, cannot be erased, and so I gathered every shred of it, one page, one photograph, one whispered rumor at a time, preparing for the moment when silence would turn into revelation. The warning came quietly, almost in a whisper, from the loyal accountant I had placed inside the company. She told me Riley had been pressing the legal department to prepare drafts of share transfer documents, each one designed to move Aiden's holdings into her name. The staff assumed it was part of some future estate planning, but she knew better. The frequency of Riley's requests, the urgency in her tone, and the secrecy around the files all suggested something darker. When I heard it, I felt my chest tighten. My husband's name, the very foundation of our company, was being used to slowly shift everything into the hands of a woman who had not earned any of it. I decided to check for myself. Late one afternoon, when the office was quiet, I stepped into Aiden's private room. He had always trusted me with his keys, but opening his drawers that day felt like crossing a line I had never wanted to approach. Inside, I found the drafts, pages upon pages of contracts with his signature scribbled across them. They were not filed with the board of directors, not even discussed in official meetings. They were simply waiting, half hidden, as though prepared for a moment when no one would question. My fingers trembled as I turned each page. The ink was his, but the design was hers. It was not only the transfers that disturbed me. Several new deals had been pushed through under Aiden's approval, selling assets at shockingly low values. Properties that should have supported our future had been let go for prices that insulted decades of effort. Competitors suddenly had access to routes and resorts that once belonged exclusively to us. It was too neat, too convenient. Someone inside was feeding them exactly what they needed, and that someone was tied to the woman I had welcomed into our home. I did not storm into a meeting or confront Aiden then and there. Rage alone would not protect what we had built. Instead, I copied everything. Each document, each suspicious contract, each signature that placed our empire in jeopardy. I made quiet trips to my lawyer's office, handing over the files one at a time. He examined them with a grim expression and said what I already knew in my heart. There was fraud here, deliberate and careful, the kind that destroys families as much as companies. I walked back to my car that evening with the copies tucked under my arm. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. It felt as though those shadows followed me home, whispering that I had uncovered only the beginning. I knew I had to be patient, to gather every thread of evidence until the truth formed a net too strong for Riley to escape. The cracks within my family did not appear overnight. They crept in slowly, quiet as shadows, until one day I realized the warmth of my own home had grown cold. Ryder, my son, was the first I noticed drifting away. Riley had learned exactly how to pull at his heart. She pretended to be fragile, often holding her stomach with a sigh or lying on the couch with a pale face. She whispered to Ryder that she felt unwell but did not want to trouble anyone. I watched my son rush to her side with every gesture, convinced he was protecting a delicate wife. He grew busier with work as well, burying himself in projects and traveling for clients, leaving me fewer chances to speak with him directly. Whenever I tried, Riley was always there, intercepting, smiling sweetly, making sure I never had a private word with my son. At the same time, Aiden changed. For decades we had shared dinners, no matter how late, as a ritual that bound us together. Suddenly he claimed endless meetings, paperwork that could not wait, clients who demanded his attention until the night hours. He began missing meals, leaving me to sit alone at a table meant for a family. When he did appear, he was distant, his answers clipped, his eyes sliding away from mine. I would search his face for the man I had known all my life, but it was as if he was disappearing into another world, one I was not invited to enter. Riley, meanwhile, perfected her performance. To the outside world, and even within the walls of our mansion, she played the devoted daughter-in-law. She called me her second mother in front of Ryder's friends, offered to help with household tasks, and sometimes shed tears when speaking to others, claiming that I did not like her. Her voice would tremble as she said she wished to be accepted, painting herself as the victim of my supposed coldness. The act was clever. Relatives and staff began to look at me with sympathy for her, while my own explanations sounded sharp and defensive. Little by little, I felt the walls closing in. At gatherings, conversations shifted around me as if I no longer belonged. My words were met with silence, my presence treated like a formality rather than the anchor it had once been. I could see Riley's hand in all of it, weaving herself into every corner of our lives, turning Ryder's devotion and Aiden's distance into weapons against me. For the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger inside the house I had built brick by brick, the house that had once been a symbol of unity. Now it was becoming a stage, and I was cast as the outsider in my own family. The investigation soon uncovered something that could no longer be explained away as ambition or innocence. The detective returned with photographs of Riley slipping into a cafe on the edge of town, not with Aiden this time, but with two executives from a rival travel company. Their conversation was discreet, heads bent close together, papers exchanged quickly before they departed. When I saw the images, my heart sank. Those men were known competitors, always circling our business, always hungry for the roots and properties Aiden and I had built. And now it was Riley feeding them at our expense. Not long after, a new piece of evidence reached me. The accountant I trusted forwarded an internal report. A copy of an email had been leaked, traced to a secondary account Riley had created under a different name. The content was chilling. It contained confidential details about our upcoming projects, exact numbers of projected revenue, and internal pricing strategies. According to my lawyer, this was more than betrayal. In legal terms, it was a clear breach of fiduciary duty, the kind of act that could strip Riley of any position she held and leave her liable in court. I stared at the email again and again, wondering how I could have misjudged her so completely. The damage was already visible in our finances. A large sum of money had vanished from the company's central accounts. On paper, it had been transferred to a fund that Riley was supposedly managing for marketing initiatives. In reality, it was nothing but a shell, a place for her to move assets out of reach. I reviewed the ledgers myself late at night, my hands tightening around the pages. The numbers told a story of theft and deceit, more painful than any rumor or whisper could. With these pieces in hand, I finally felt that I held enough to bring her down. Photographs, emails, financial records, all linked to her name. It was enough to call the police, enough to summon the board, enough to end her place in our family and company. Yet I did not strike immediately. I had learned in life that timing is as powerful as truth. If I moved too soon, they would claim misunderstanding, paint me as jealous or paranoid. So I waited. I let the evidence rest in my lawyer's safe while I carried on my days as though nothing had changed. But inside, I was sharper than ever, listening, watching, waiting for the moment when their own arrogance would make the fall undeniable. I knew the time had not yet come to strike. Confronting Aiden and Riley head-on would only drive them deeper into denial and secrecy. They would find a way to twist my words, to make me look like a jealous old woman clinging to control. So I made a choice that surprised even myself. I announced to my family that I was going on a long trip to Europe. I spoke of it casually, as though I wanted nothing more than to enjoy art museums, gardens, and the quiet streets of Paris and Rome. To them, it looked like retreat, a tired wife stepping back to live out her leisure years. In truth, it was the sharpest move I had ever made. I wanted Riley and Aidan to believe I was distracted, no longer watching their every move. I wanted them to relax into their false confidence, to commit mistakes without the mask of caution. When I saw the flicker of relief in Riley's eyes as I packed my bags, I knew the bait had been taken. She kissed my cheek sweetly in front of Ryder, wishing me a safe journey, while her glance at Aidan lingered too long. That single look told me I had played my part well. While I visited cathedrals in Spain and strolled along the canals of Venice, I was never truly away. Each evening, from the privacy of my hotel room, I sent scanned copies of the contracts, emails, and photographs to my attorney. I requested that he begin drafting filings for court, should the time come. At the same time, I met discreetly with contacts in banking who agreed to freeze certain company accounts, stopping the bleeding of funds Riley had been siphoning. I walked through cobblestone streets by day, but by night I was tightening the noose around her. The distance worked in my favor. From across the ocean I could almost hear Riley's arrogance grow. Reports from the detective showed she and Aidan were moving more openly, attending dinners without subtlety, spending company money with little disguise. She believed I had turned my back. That was exactly what I wanted. Each careless step she took gave me another stone to stack onto the wall of evidence that would one day bury her. That trip became my perfect feint. I was the woman on holiday, posting postcards and telling friends I was enjoying the food and sights of Europe. Beneath that mask, I was the woman preparing a counterattack, ensuring that when I finally returned, I would not only face them with anger, but with undeniable proof and legal force. The game had shifted. They thought they were winning, but the truth was already in my hands, waiting for the moment I chose to reveal it. The call came on a quiet afternoon, shattering the illusion of peace I had carefully built during my time abroad. Riley had secretly undergone breast augmentation at a luxury clinic, not because of Ryder, but to please Aidan. It was a detail I would only piece together later, yet even in that moment, something about the news struck me as wrong. My son's wife had chosen to risk her body for vanity, or perhaps for the approval of a man who was not her husband. The procedure did not go as planned. Within hours of leaving the operating room, Riley developed a severe hematoma. Blood pooled where it should not have, her chest swelling painfully, her skin turning a frightening shade. She screamed with agony, her blood pressure falling so quickly that the nurses struggled to stabilize her. Panic spread through the clinic as they prepared her for emergency surgery. They needed to drain the clot, but more dangerously, she had already lost too much blood. The doctors ran tests, desperate for a solution. That was when they discovered her blood type, AB-Rh negative. Less than 1% of Americans carry it, one of the rarest types in the country. It was almost impossible to keep enough in stock, and the clinic's blood bank was already stretched thin. The surgeon explained to Ryder and Aidan that without an immediate transfusion from a matching donor, Riley might not survive the night. Then came the cruel twist of fate. By sheer coincidence, I shared the same rare blood type. AB-Rh negative had never seemed significant to me before. It had simply been another line on my medical file. Now it was the single factor that stood between Riley and death. The doctor's words were firm. Scarlett is the only family member who can save her quickly. Without her, we are helpless. The phone in my hotel room rang again and again. First Ryder, frantic and near tears, begging me to return. Then Aidan, his voice shaking, no longer the confident man I had known, but a husband pleading for mercy. Finally, Riley herself, sobbing and gasping for breath, whispering that she was sorry, that she needed me. Each call pressed against my heart, heavy as stone. They wanted me to be the savior. They wanted me to give not just forgiveness, but my very blood to the woman who had betrayed everything I stood for. I sat there in silence, staring out at the European night sky. A strange calm came over me. Destiny, it seemed, had placed a cruel choice in my hands. The phone rang with a sound that cut straight through the quiet of my hotel room. I answered, and it was Ryder, his voice frantic, breaking in places I had never heard before. "Mom, please, Riley needs you. She might die." His words tumbled out, panicked, almost incoherent. For a moment I could not breathe. The desperation in my son's voice pierced through every layer of doubt I had carried these past months. Before I could gather myself, another call came. It was Aiden. "Scarlett, only you can save her. Please don't let her die." His tone was cracked, stripped of the authority I had once admired in him. It was not the voice of my husband of 40 years, but of a man begging for salvation, clinging to me as though I were the last hope left. The irony stung like fire. For so long he had turned away from me, and now suddenly I was the one he needed most. Then came Riley. Her sobs carried through the line, her breath jagged and shallow. "Mom, forgive me. I need your blood to survive." The word mom slipped from her lips, deliberate or desperate, I could not tell. It was a word she had often used in public to charm me, to convince the world of her loyalty. But now, in the darkness of her hospital bed, it was not performance. It was survival. And it landed heavy in my chest, reminding me of the cruel paradox of life, that sometimes the one who wounds you most is the one who pleads for your mercy. I sat there frozen, the phone pressed to my ear, my heart pounding with a rhythm I could not calm. I thought of the nights Riley had smiled sweetly while planting seeds of doubt in my family. I thought of Aiden's evasive glances, of Ryder's blind devotion, of the photographs, the contracts, the betrayal. Every wound came rushing back. And yet, I had never once turned away from my family. Not when we were poor and struggling to build the company. Not when sacrifices meant giving up my own dreams. I had never denied them anything. So when the calls ended, I rose without hesitation. My suitcase was still half unpacked from the week before. I threw my clothes inside, zipped it shut, and picked up the phone again, this time to book an emergency flight. The agent told me the earliest seat left for America departed in 3 hours. I confirmed it instantly. I abandoned the tours I had planned, the museums I had dreamed of for years, the serenity of Europe I thought I had earned. None of it mattered. My family had called, and once again I answered. The storm followed me home. Rain lashed against the windows of the car as I was driven from the airport to the estate, the headlights slicing through sheets of water. My heart was heavy, torn between fear and duty. Ryder's voice still echoed in my mind, desperate and pleading. I imagined Riley pale and fragile, her body weakened by blood loss, clinging to life. I thought of walking through the door and rushing to her side, of holding my son's hand as he begged for hope. That was the picture I carried with me through the long flight, the picture that justified leaving everything behind in Europe. By the time I stepped through the iron gates, it was well past midnight. Thunder rolled above, shaking the night air. I moved quickly through the courtyard, my coat soaked despite the umbrella. The house loomed ahead, glowing faintly through the storm, and I braced myself for the scene I had been told to expect. My heart pounded, ready to face a dying daughter-in-law, ready to give my blood if it meant saving my son's family. But when I entered the mansion, it was not sorrow that greeted me. The halls were quiet, no sign of panic, no hurried footsteps of nurses or doctors. Instead, I noticed a soft glow spilling from upstairs, from the master bedroom that had always been mine. The door was slightly ajar, a thin stream of yellow light cutting into the darkness. I froze on the staircase, every instinct screaming. I climbed slowly, each step heavier than the last, the storm outside echoing in my ears. When I reached the landing, I stopped. Through the narrow crack of the door, I saw a sight that made my blood run cold. Riley was not pale or gasping for air. She was draped in a silk nightgown, the fabric thin enough to reveal the curve of her body. She leaned her head coyly against Aiden's shoulder, her lips curling in a smile that was anything but weak. Her laughter was low, sharp, the sound of triumph rather than pain. Aiden's hand rested possessively at her waist. He whispered something I could not hear, and Riley tilted her face toward him, her expression full of wicked delight. In that instant, I understood. The crisis had been exaggerated. The bleeding, the hospital, the desperate phone calls. All of it had been nothing but a lure to bring me back in a rush, to make me vulnerable. Riley's so-called emergency had been patched with medication, enough to send her home with a follow-up appointment. She was never on the brink of death. I stood there in silence, drenched coat clinging to me, the storm raging outside and an even greater storm rising within me. My hands shook, not from fear but from clarity. The truth was no longer hidden. It was laid bare in the light spilling from that room. For a moment I could not move. My breath caught in my throat and my whole body trembled at the sight before me. 40 years of marriage, decades of building a life and a family, and now it lay desecrated under the dim light of my own bedroom lamp. Riley's laughter, Aiden's hand at her waist, the shameless betrayal in the very space that had once been my sanctuary. I wanted to burst through the door, to scream, to drag them both into the storm outside. But instinct, honed through years of survival and leadership, pulled me back from the edge. Anger alone would not save me. Only proof would. My fingers steadied as I reached into my coat pocket. I pulled out my phone, its screen glowing faintly in the dark hallway. Slowly, quietly, I raised it toward the door. Through the narrow gap, I captured the scene piece by piece. The curve of Riley's smile, her head resting on Aiden's shoulder, his lips bent close to her ear, the silk nightgown that left nothing to the imagination. I tapped once, then again, the soft clicks of the camera lost beneath the thunder outside. I switched to video, the frame trembling only for a moment before my hand grew firm. Their whispers, her low giggle, his murmured reassurances, all of it recorded. Each second of footage was another nail in the coffin of their lies. No longer could Riley claim she was a devoted wife. No longer could Aiden pretend to be the loyal husband. What I held in my palm was more than evidence of infidelity. It was the truth of a larger deception, the proof that Riley had feigned weakness, manipulated her so-called illness, and used her supposed suffering to claw her way into power. The narrative they had spun of a fragile daughter-in-law and a dutiful husband crumbled in the lens of my phone. I lowered the device, sliding it back into my pocket with a calmness that surprised even me. My heart still ached, my body still shook, but my mind was sharper than ever. This was the weapon I needed, the shield against their gaslighting, the golden evidence that no lawyer, no board member, no family friend could deny. I had it all now, the documents, the financial trails, and finally, the most intimate betrayal, caught not in rumor or suspicion, but in the undeniable clarity of images and sound. I stepped back from the door, the storm still raging outside, and for the first time in months, I felt the power return to my chest. They thought they had trapped me. They thought I was cornered. But I had just turned their arrogance into my strongest proof. I did not burst through the door. I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing my rage. Instead, I turned on my heel, the storm still rattling the windows behind me, and walked away in silence. Let them laugh. Let them believe they had won. Their illusion of victory was the very shield that would keep them blind while I prepared my strike. Every step down the staircase was heavy, but each one carried me further from despair and closer to resolve. In the quiet of my study, I dried my trembling hands with a towel, unlocked my phone, and played the video back one more time. Riley's smile, Aiden's touch, the whispered laughter, it was all there, framed perfectly in pixels. No one could deny what the camera had captured. The bitterness in my chest hardened into something sharper, something colder. I opened a secure channel and sent the files to my lawyer. With the upload, I added only a single line: "Prepare for court. I'll give them the gift they deserve." The words felt like iron as I typed them, not fueled by vengeance alone, but by clarity. For months I had been surrounded by shadows, whispers, doubts that no one would believe without proof. Now the proof was undeniable. What had begun as a desperate plea for my blood, a supposed fight for Riley's life, had turned into my chance to expose everything. Fate had delivered me to this very point. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the storm batter the estate. It no longer sounded like chaos. It sounded like applause. Outside, thunder roared as though echoing the certainty that this chapter of deception was drawing to a close. My heart, though still bruised, beat with a steady rhythm. I knew now what had to be done. No confrontation in anger, no reckless shouting. The courtroom would be my battlefield, the law my sword. Upstairs, Aidan and Riley likely still whispered in triumph, believing themselves clever, untouchable. They could not know that at that very moment their downfall had already begun. They had lured me back under the guise of desperation, but in doing so, they had revealed themselves more completely than they ever intended. And I, the woman they thought too blind, too old, too fragile, had chosen silence not as surrender but as strategy. I closed my eyes and let the calm settle over me. Soon, everyone would see them for who they truly were. The gift they had given me, their arrogance, their recklessness, was now the gift I would return, wrapped in the truth they could no longer escape. The morning after that storm, I boarded a flight to New York with a folder clutched tightly in my hands. Inside were the copies of every contract I had secretly taken from Aidan's office, the drafts Riley had prepared for him to sign. I remember the feel of the paper, sharp against my fingertips, as if it were already cutting into the future of my family. I walked into my attorney's office with the same calmness I once carried into high-stakes negotiations, but inside me a storm was still raging. He greeted me with his usual firm handshake, then motioned for me to place the documents on his desk. Page after page he read in silence, his brow furrowing deeper with every clause. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression that was both incredulous and grave. "Scarlett, these terms are disastrous. If your husband signs even one of these, he will transfer every share he owns and every voting right directly into Riley's hands. There will be nothing left to fight for." My stomach turned as he explained further. According to corporate law, such a transfer could be challenged, but only if evidence of coercion or fraud existed. The wording was clever, disguised as estate planning, as though Aidan were simply preparing for the future. But hidden in the fine print were clauses that would make Riley untouchable once the ink dried. The lawyer circled passages with his pen, his voice steady but urgent. "This isn't just a bad contract. This is duress and fraud. If you let him sign this, your family loses everything." The words landed like hammer blows. For years, I had worked beside Aidan to build our company, brick by brick, deal by deal, turning a dream into an empire. To think that all of it could vanish with a single careless signature into the hands of the woman who had dismantled my trust was almost unbearable. I felt a surge of cold clarity. This was no longer about jealousy, no longer just about betrayal of love. It was theft, calculated and legal if left unchallenged. I leaned across the desk, my voice low but steady. "Then we fight, whatever it takes." The attorney nodded, his pen already moving to draft injunctions, preliminary motions, safeguards. He promised to begin proceedings immediately, filing in both corporate and family court if necessary. His eyes met mine with a resolve that steadied me. "Scarlett, you did the right thing coming here. Had you waited even a few more days, it might have been too late." I walked out into the streets of New York with the wind cutting against my face, the folder lighter in my hands now that it was in his care. For the first time in weeks, I felt the faint stirrings of control returning to me. I was no longer gathering pieces of suspicion. I was preparing a case, and the law, once distant, was now the weapon in my grasp. The deeper I dug, the clearer the picture became. My private investigator, working hand in hand with the loyal accountant I had placed inside the company, uncovered details that left no room for doubt. Riley was not only betraying my family's trust, but selling it to the highest bidder. One of our strongest competitors, a firm based in Miami, had been receiving confidential information about our routes, pricing strategies, and expansion plans. And it had all come from inside our own headquarters. The first evidence arrived in the form of a leaked email. Riley had created a secondary account under a false name, but she had been careless. The investigator traced the IP address back to our corporate network, proof that the leaks had not been fabricated but sent directly from her desk. The words on the screen made my stomach twist. She had promised exclusive insights in exchange for compensation, casually offering the very strategies Aidan and I had spent years refining. To see our life's work reduced to bargaining chips in her hands filled me with a cold fury I had not felt before. Then came the financial trail. My accountant showed me transfers, large sums funneled through a shell corporation registered in Florida. On the surface, it looked like payments for consulting services, but peel back the layers and the truth emerged. The destination was Riley's personal account. I sat at my desk, staring at the ledger, at the numbers lined neatly in black and white. Every figure was a scar, proof that she had taken what did not belong to her and converted it into personal wealth. My lawyer reviewed the evidence with a face carved in stone. Scarlett, this is more than betrayal. This is breach of fiduciary duty. Under U.S. law, that means she has violated the fundamental obligation to act in the company's best interest. What you have here could lead to civil damages, even criminal charges if pursued aggressively. His words carried weight, but it was the truth I already knew. Riley was not just a liar or a manipulator, she was a thief. As I closed the folder of evidence, a strange calm washed over me. For so long I had doubted myself, wondering if I was imagining her schemes. But here it was, undeniable, documented, ready to stand in court. She thought she had played the game so cleverly, hiding behind charm and feigned weakness. Yet even the most careful thief leaves a trail, and I now had the trail that would lead her straight to her downfall. Just as I was gathering my strength to strike back, fate delivered another cruel twist. Riley's condition worsened, and she was rushed into the emergency ward under flashing hospital lights. The doctors spoke with urgency, their words heavy, clinical, impossible to misinterpret. Her blood pressure is crashing. She needs an immediate transfusion. The problem is her blood type, AB negative, rare, less than 1% of the population. Without it, she may not survive the night. I stood at the edge of the sterile white corridor, the fluorescent lights above buzzing like hornets, my hands clasped together so tightly my knuckles ached. The irony was unbearable. After all her lies, her manipulation, her betrayal, it was my blood, the very lifeline running through my veins, that could save her. Destiny had placed me once again at the crossroads between mercy and destruction. Ryder fell to his knees before me, his face streaked with tears I had not seen since he was a child. "Mom, please! She's my wife, save her!" His voice cracked, every syllable tearing at my heart. I wanted to reach out, to hold him, to ease the agony in his eyes. But another truth pressed harder against my chest. Saving Riley meant strengthening the enemy who had already poisoned this family. Aidan stood nearby, his face ashen, lips trembling with a plea he did not dare speak aloud. For a moment his eyes met mine, those familiar eyes I once trusted with every secret, now clouded with shame. He wanted me to give in, to surrender once again to the role of peacemaker, the woman who sacrifices everything for family harmony. But harmony was already dead. My heart bled inside me. Ryder was my son, the child I carried, the boy I had nurtured into manhood. His pain was my pain, his desperation my burden. Every instinct of a mother screamed at me to save him from grief, yet my mind remained cold and clear. If I gave Riley what she asked for, if I offered her my blood, then I would be binding myself to her survival, erasing every chance to bring her schemes to light. I would be handing her another weapon to wield against me. So I stayed silent. My lips pressed together, my eyes locked not on Riley's hospital door but on Ryder's pleading face. He begged, he wept, he called me heartless. And still, I did not move. I could not move. Because deep within me I knew, sometimes love for a son means protecting him not from pain in the moment, but from a lifetime chained to the wrong woman. And that meant letting the storm rage a little longer. Ryder did not know. He had no idea about the secret between Riley and Aidan. He did not know about the contracts gone wrong or the money gone missing. He only saw the woman he married pale on that hospital bed and his world narrowing to one single frantic need. When he fell to his knees in front of me, his voice broke and he sounded like a boy again, not the man who had run meetings and negotiated deals. "Mom, please," he said. "She is my wife. Save her." The words landed like a physical blow, and for a second I felt the old reflex of mothering rise up to answer, to move, to help. He cried then, real, ragged sobs that shook his shoulders, and I watched him as if seeing him through a pane of glass. His hands gripped mine like they had when he was small and scraped his knee. I remembered the long nights, rocking him to sleep, watching over fevers, signing papers so he could have an education, saying yes to sacrifices no one else saw. All that history of small, steady giving pooled into that moment and begged me to step forward and undo his sorrow. But he did not know the ledger entries, the emails traced back to the office, the photographs tucked in my safe, the drafts with Aiden's signature that would hand over everything with a single pen stroke. He had not seen the way Riley softened and smiled in front of him, then changed into someone else when the door closed. He had not sat in the quiet accounting room with me while I watched numbers bleed out of the company. All he knew was that his wife could die without a transfusion, and that his mother, the woman who had never said no, was holding back. In desperation, he shouted, his voice raw, "You never loved me. If you let her die, I will never forgive you." Hearing him say those words felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Every bone in me wanted to reach out, to gather him up and promise that it would be all right. I could see the people in the hallway, nurses exchanging looks, the hum of machines beyond the curtain, and I could see Ryder's face contort with a grief so immediate it made my own breath catch. He accused me not because he wanted to hurt me, but because pain makes people lunge for answers, and he needed someone to blame. I did not answer him. My silence was not cruelty, it was calculation, which somehow felt crueler. I thought of the future I had vowed to protect, the empire I had helped build with my husband, and the ruin that would come if I stitched this wound shut tonight, only to let a poison of control and fraud fester in the years ahead. I thought of the son I loved and the woman he had married, and how love for him meant more than the relief of a single night. Still, watching him kneel, watching his tears fall, I felt the world press heavy on my chest. His words echoed in my bones. "You never loved me," and they cut. When he finally rose and left the room with the desperate quickness of someone who had run out of options, he slapped the air with one last bitter glance that said he would remember this. In the hallway, I caught a glimpse of his shoulders shaking as he walked away. I listened to the sound and held it like a thing that would change me, that had to be born as part of what I would do next. My hands still trembled. My heart still throbbed. I had to be both the mother he needed and the strategist the company required, and that impossible duality is what made the silence so heavy in the room. I stood there with Ryder's tears still burning in my mind, but my voice came out calm, even steady, as I looked into his broken eyes. "One day," I said softly, "you will understand why I chose this path." He shook his head, his pain too raw to hear me, but I knew the words had to be spoken. They were not just for him. They were for me, a vow to hold on to the strength I had built from years of sacrifice. That night, I returned to my study, closed the heavy oak door, and laid out everything I had gathered on the desk. The fraudulent contracts Riley had drafted, the leaked emails with her false account and Miami IP address, the ledger showing money funneled into her private account, and the video on my phone capturing her in the arms of my husband. Piece by piece, I placed them into a single folder. Together, they told a story darker than any rumor could convey. Together, they were enough to strip her of every lie she had built. I composed a message to my attorney, attaching every file, every photograph, every recording. My fingers did not tremble this time. "Prepare the lawsuit," I wrote. "File it in both corporate and family court. We will not only expose the betrayal of marriage, but the theft of an empire." When I hit send, I felt a strange relief settle into my chest. The decision was made, and there was no going back. Next, I picked up the phone and called the chairman of the board. My voice carried no hesitation as I explained the urgency. Evidence of fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and misconduct demanded immediate action. I requested an emergency meeting to suspend Aiden's voting power until the investigation was complete. He asked if I was certain. Yes, I told him, more certain than I have ever been in my life. By the time dawn broke, the storm outside had quieted, but the storm I had set into motion was just beginning. I did not save Riley with my blood, but I would save my family's legacy with truth and justice. Let them believe me cruel, let Ryder see me as distant. In time, he would know I had chosen not vengeance but survival, not bitterness but clarity. I would not be the victim of their schemes. I would be the woman who ended them. When I walked into the hospital that morning, the sound of my heels on the linoleum floor carried louder than the murmurs in the hall. I wore my usual suit, tailored and dark, the fabric still smelling faintly of rain from the storm. My posture was upright, my expression calm, but there was no warmth left in my face. Every nurse, every orderly who glanced up seemed to sense the frost I carried with me. I had made my choice long before stepping through those doors, and nothing would shake it now. Inside the room, the air was heavy with antiseptic and desperation. Riley lay on the bed, her skin pale, lips parted, eyes fluttering as though every breath cost her effort. Yet even through her weakness, I saw the same practiced performance: the tilted head, the trembling hand, the faint smile that begged for pity. I had seen that act too many times to mistake it for truth. Ryder leapt to his feet when I entered. His face was drawn with sleepless hours, his voice raw as he clutched my hand. "Mom, please, save her." He pressed my hand as if trying to squeeze compassion back into my veins, as though the sheer force of his love could alter my resolve. Behind him, Aiden stood stiff, his eyes darting between me and Riley, his jaw tight, silent but pleading. For a moment the silence in the room thickened. Machines beeped steadily, oxygen hissed through its tube, and Riley's shallow breaths filled the space with a rhythm of fragility. I looked at them all, my son, my husband, the woman who had poisoned our family, and then I let the words fall from my lips, sharp and cold. The blood running in my veins is for those who honor family, not those who destroy it. The words hung in the sterile air like shards of glass. Ryder flinched, his grip tightening before slipping away. Riley's eyes widened, her lips trembling as though she had expected me to fold. Aiden's shoulders sagged, and for once in years he could not find a single defense. I stood unmoved, every inch of me certain that this was the only truth left to speak. The moment after my words fell, the air seemed to crack open with commotion. Doors swung wide at the end of the corridor, and suddenly a flood of voices, clicking cameras, and hurried footsteps filled the sterile silence. Reporters with notepads and microphones, photographers with lenses flashing, all pressed forward, their eyes sharp with hunger for a story. And it was no accident. I had sent the invitation myself hours earlier, when I knew the confrontation could no longer be contained in private walls. Gasps echoed through the hall. Nurses stopped mid-step, patients peeked from doorways, and even the doctors paused with charts in their hands. What had been a family crisis was now a spectacle. The world was watching, and every angle of it, the tears, the pleas, the silence, was captured in real time. Riley's reaction was almost theatrical. She snatched at the blanket and pulled it up to her face, twisting her body away from the cameras. Her sobs grew louder, though her eyes darted sideways, searching for escape. The same woman who had orchestrated lies so carefully now clawed at shadows, desperate to hide. She whispered frantically to Ryder, but her words were drowned beneath the reporters calling out her name. Aiden, on the other hand, stood frozen. His shoulders sagged, his eyes hollow. For a man once respected in boardrooms and admired at social galas, the weight of shame was unbearable. He knew what came next: the contracts, the emails, the financial evidence, the photographs. I would not keep them secret. Every camera in that hallway was now a mirror reflecting the downfall he had chosen with his own hands. And then there was Ryder. My son looked at me, confusion written across his face. His lips parted as though to ask why I would bring outsiders into the most intimate wound of our family. He did not understand that this was the only way to break the silence, the only way to end the gaslighting and manipulation. Pain twisted his features, and for a fleeting moment I saw him as the child who once clung to me for comfort. Now, he clung to Riley's image of weakness, blind to the truth I was forcing into the light. The flashbulbs burned, the microphones pushed forward, and I stood steady in the storm I had summoned. What they thought was cruelty was, in truth, the only justice left. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. When the cameras were rolling and the microphones shoved forward, I reached into my bag and pulled out a sleek tablet. The weight of it felt heavier than steel in my hand, because I knew what it contained would crush every lie Riley had ever told. With a single tap, the screen came alive, bright against the sterile hospital lights. Gasps filled the hall as the first image appeared. There was Riley, draped in a silk nightgown, the very same one I had seen with my own eyes, curled into Aiden's shoulder inside the bedroom that belonged to me. Her smile was sly, her body leaning against him with a familiarity that could not be mistaken. I swiped again, and another image flashed across the screen. Reporters surged closer, their shutters snapping like gunfire. Then I pressed play. The video filled the silence with Riley's voice, low and coy, whispering sweetly as she brushed her hand along Aiden's arm. She tilted her head, laughed softly, her words dripping with intimacy. Aiden leaned toward her, his hand settling on her waist, his face inches from hers. The room erupted as the betrayal unfolded in motion, undeniable and obscene. Whispers turned into shouts among the reporters. "Scandal!" one voice hissed. "The daughter-in-law with her own father-in-law!" Others echoed, the air buzzing with shock and disbelief. Nurses covered their mouths, a doctor dropped his chart, and even strangers passing through the corridor stopped to stare. On the bed, Riley let out a scream, covering her face with both hands. "It's not true! She faked it!" she wailed, her voice rising high, breaking under the weight of her own panic. But her denial only fed the frenzy. Cameras zoomed in, microphones lunged closer, hungry for every word of her collapse. And then there was Aiden. He did not shout. He did not deny. He simply lowered his head, eyes fixed on the floor, the silence of a guilty man heavier than any confession. That single gesture, his refusal to meet the world's gaze, confirmed what the images already declared. The betrayal was real, and no one watching could doubt it now. I stood steady, letting the evidence speak louder than my own anger ever could. In that moment, justice no longer belonged to whispers or suspicions. It stood before everyone, glowing on a screen, impossible to erase. I did not stop with the images. One betrayal might stir scandal, but the world needed to see the depth of Riley's scheme. From my folder, I withdrew printed documents and handed them to my attorney, who had stood silently at my side until now. With calm precision, he connected my tablet to the screen again, and the first set of emails appeared. The headers glowed bright under the hospital's fluorescent lights, each one traced to Riley's hidden account. The body of the messages left no room for doubt. Confidential market analyses, future pricing strategies, and exclusive deals sent straight to our competitor in Miami. And in return, bank transfers flowed into her personal account through a shell company. The reporters leaned forward, pens scratching furiously as cameras clicked. Even the medical staff stopped moving, their eyes locked on the scrolling text. The silence was broken only by my lawyer's voice as he began to explain. Each contract Riley had drafted, transferring Aiden's shares, undervaluing assets, selling property at fractions of its worth, could not stand in a court of law. These documents, he said, show clear evidence of duress and fraud. Any judge would declare them void. His tone was steady, but the weight of his words filled the hallway like a verdict already passed. I stepped closer, holding up one of the pages so even those in the back could see. My voice was steady, though it echoed with all the years of sacrifice that had brought me here. She tried to bleed this family dry, not just with lies, but with fraud. The words rang through the hall, cutting sharper than any accusation. The photographers froze for a second before their flashes exploded again, catching every line of my face, every flicker of Riley's collapse. On the hospital bed, Riley crumpled inward. Her shoulders shook, her face drained of color until she was as pale as the sheets she clutched. The tears that streaked down her cheeks were no longer the practiced sobs of a manipulator. They were the breakdown of someone who had been cornered by truth. She tried to open her mouth, but no words came out. Her breath hitched, and she turned her face away from the lights as if she could hide from the evidence now swallowing her whole. Around us, the corridor was hushed. Doctors stood frozen, nurses clutched their clipboards, reporters momentarily forgot their questions. The truth had silenced them all. For months, Riley had lived behind masks and shadows, twisting sympathy into power. But with every email, every fraudulent draft, every number traced to her account, the masks fell one by one. And for the first time, she could not hide. Riley's screams tore through the sterile air, shrill and desperate, as though sheer volume could undo the evidence already etched across the screens. She clutched Ryder's hands with a grip so tight her knuckles turned white. "Please believe me, I did it for us." Her voice cracked, breaking into sobs, but Ryder did not move. His eyes were wide, glassy with horror, staring at her as if the woman before him was a stranger. The girl he thought he had married, sweet, gentle, loyal, was gone, replaced by someone capable of betrayal so deep it shattered the very ground beneath his feet. Beside them, Aidan shifted as if to speak. His lips parted, but no sound came. For a man who had spent decades commanding boardrooms with confident speeches, the silence was deafening. He glanced at me, searching for some fragment of mercy, but all he found was my gaze, steady and cold. I did not need to speak. One glance was enough, and the weight of my contempt pressed heavier than any words could. His throat tightened, his excuses died there, swallowed by the shame that wrapped itself around him like chains. Ryder collapsed back into a chair, his body folding in on itself. His head dropped into his hands, his shoulders shaking, but no tears came, only the hollow tremor of a man stripped of certainty. In a single moment, he had lost the woman he called his wife and the father he once admired. Betrayal on both sides carved him open, leaving him with nothing but a void too heavy to bear. He did not look up again. The world he had trusted had dissolved in front of cameras, strangers, and the mother he had once doubted. I turned then, not with anger, but with the calm dignity of a woman who had endured and prevailed. My steps were measured, my back straight, my head lifted high. Behind me, chaos reigned, Riley sobbing, Aidan silent, Ryder broken. Reporters shouted questions, flashes lit the hallway, but I did not pause. Every step I took carried me further from the wreckage and closer to the freedom I had been denied for too long. They had thought they could destroy me quietly, in the shadows of deceit. Instead, it was they who fell in the brightest light, undone not by my rage but by their own arrogance. I left them there, in the ruins of their lies, knowing the world had witnessed their collapse. Riley's downfall did not end in that hospital corridor. It only began there. Within days, the civil court accepted the petition against her, filed with stacks of documents my lawyer had prepared. The charges were grave and undeniable: financial fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and the willful destruction of a marriage through adultery. The judges, hardened by years of similar cases, barely concealed their disgust as they reviewed the evidence. Riley's name was no longer whispered with admiration but spat out with contempt in legal chambers. At the same time, the company we had built released its own statement. The board of directors gathered in a rare emergency session and voted unanimously to disclose the evidence that had surfaced: Riley's emails, her secret transfers, her conversations with our competitor in Miami. For the first time, shareholders who once praised her charm and fresh ideas saw her clearly for what she was: a parasite feeding on the very empire she pretended to support. Their fury was unrestrained. Demands for lawsuits came pouring in, their voices uniting into a single cry for justice. Ryder, once blinded by love, could not ignore the truth any longer. The betrayal had been too public, too humiliating, too well documented. He filed for divorce the very next week. The court processed it swiftly, the pile of photographs and recordings leaving no room for doubt. There was no custody battle, no negotiation, no long mediation. It was as though the law itself wanted to cut ties as quickly as possible, to close the book on a union that had rotted from within. Then came the storm of the media. Headlines screamed across every platform, from local papers to national broadcasts. Daughter-in-law slept with her father-in-law and stole from the family business. The story spread like wildfire, the kind of scandal Americans could not look away from. Neighbors whispered, co-workers turned their backs, and even strangers on the street recoiled at the mention of her name. She had once been the picture of the perfect daughter-in-law, polished and graceful, introduced at galas with pride. Now she was the symbol of disgrace, mocked and despised across the country. Riley could no longer walk into a restaurant without feeling the burn of 1,000 stares. She could no longer scroll through her phone without seeing her face plastered on screens, tagged with words like traitor, fraud, adulteress. The transformation was complete. From the woman I once thought would carry my family forward, she had become a cautionary tale told in every living room. And though my heart carried scars from what she had done, I could not deny the sharp satisfaction of seeing the truth finally rip away her mask. Aiden's collapse came swiftly, like a tower crumbling once its foundation was exposed as hollow. For decades he had been respected in boardrooms, his handshake considered solid, his word as good as any contract. But after the scandal, no one would return his calls. Invitations to conferences disappeared, partnerships dissolved overnight. The board of directors met in an emergency session and stripped him of his voting rights, declaring him unfit to represent the company he once co-founded. In one decision, they severed him from the empire he had helped build, leaving him as nothing more than a figurehead with no power. The financial blow followed quickly. The contracts he had signed under Riley's influence, documents undervaluing assets, fraudulent transfers, were all revoked. Those cancellations came at a price. Lawsuits began to pile up, claim after claim demanding restitution. Legal teams from angry partners calculated damages in the millions, and suddenly the man who once sat at the head of the table now sat across from lawyers, warning him of bankruptcy and even criminal exposure. His name, once a shield of credibility, became a red flag in every business circle. But the deepest wound was not financial. It came one evening when the phone rang from overseas. His daughter, the child he had once carried on his shoulders and proudly sent to study abroad, spoke with a voice colder than any judge. "From now on, you are no longer my father." The line clicked dead after that, leaving him staring at the receiver in disbelief. In that moment, the shame was complete. His greed and betrayal had not only destroyed his reputation, but severed the blood ties he had taken for granted. At home, the silence pressed against him like a weight. Scarlett no longer spoke to him except through attorneys. Ryder would not answer his calls. Even Riley, once his secret companion, was locked in her own battle for survival. The mansion that had once been filled with family dinners and celebrations now echoed with his footsteps alone. He poured himself drinks that did not soothe him, sat in rooms too large for a man suddenly so small. Outside those walls, the community he once entertained at galas and golf courses turned their backs. Neighbors whispered, colleagues shook their heads, and the man who had once basked in admiration became a cautionary tale whispered in disgust. Aiden had spent his life chasing respect and legacy, but in the end, he was left with neither. He was not a leader, not a husband, not a father, only a shell of the man he once pretended to be, staring into the emptiness of a house that no longer felt like home. Ryder's collapse was quieter than Riley's hysterics or Aiden's public disgrace, but it cut deeper because it was written in silence and shame. In the space of days, he had lost both the woman he believed to be his wife and the father he thought he could look up to. The foundation of his life cracked beneath him, and for a time he wandered in confusion, searching for someone to blame. At first he lashed out at me, clinging to anger as though it might shield him from the truth. He shouted that I had ruined everything, that I had orchestrated the spectacle to destroy his marriage, but the words fell hollow, even as he said them. When the headlines quieted and the cameras moved on, Ryder was left alone with the evidence. He replayed the videos again and again, at first with disbelief, then with dawning horror. He read the contracts, the emails, the transfers. No matter how many times he looked, the truth did not change. Riley's betrayal was written in ink and pixels, and Aiden's guilt was sealed in his silence. Ryder broke then, not in public, but alone, where no one could see him but the walls that had once held his family. For the first time since boyhood he wept, the tears unstoppable, his shoulders trembling with regret. The next morning he came to me. I was in the garden pruning roses when I heard his footsteps slow on the gravel path. He stood for a long time, head bowed, before finally kneeling in front of me. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Mom, I should have trusted you." I set aside my shears and placed a hand on his shoulder, not in triumph, but in quiet acknowledgement of a son who had finally seen clearly. There was no need for long speeches. His apology was enough. From that day forward, Ryder began the slow work of rebuilding. He attended meetings not as Riley's puppet or Aiden's shadow, but as a man determined to learn. He asked questions, took notes, listened to the senior managers he had once ignored. He sought my guidance daily, and for the first time in years, I saw the spark of responsibility in his eyes. It was not an easy path, and the shame of his blindness would linger, but the choice was his. He could remain broken, or he could rise with humility. Ryder chose to rise and to walk beside me, ready at last to protect what mattered. The company that had once trembled on the edge of collapse began to breathe again the moment the truth was laid bare. With Riley exposed and Aiden stripped of power, I stepped back into the boardroom, not as a figurehead, but as the rightful steward of what I had built. The board of directors, many of whom had watched silently as the cracks widened under Riley's schemes, now turned their eyes to me with relief. They voted unanimously to restore my full authority, their voices filled not only with respect but with gratitude. It was not a triumphant return, it was a rescue, for them as much as for me. Slowly, the projects Riley had sabotaged were revived. The partnerships she had tried to undermine answered my calls without hesitation. Old friends in the industry, loyal to the reputation I had spent years cultivating, stepped forward with offers of support. Contracts once thought lost were renegotiated, tours and routes were reopened, and the damage began to heal. Every deal renewed was a declaration that the company's heart still beat strong and that its future could still be trusted. The shareholders, who had been restless and suspicious for months, now stood behind me with open confidence. At the annual meeting, they rose from their seats and spoke candidly. Their message was clear. They would not let Riley's betrayal define us. They filed their own claims for restitution, demanding that she repay every dollar she had stolen. The sight of their unity was a reminder that integrity, once doubted, could be restored when leaders had the courage to act openly. For a time, I had feared the worst, that bankruptcy would tarnish everything Aiden and I had built from the ground up, that our name would become a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms. Instead, the opposite unfolded. The scandal, painful as it had been, became the very proof of our resilience. The market began to respond. Articles no longer described us as a sinking ship, but as a company reborn, praised for its transparency and willingness to hold wrongdoers accountable. What Riley had tried to poison became the cure that restored us. As I walked out of those meetings, shoulders straight and head high, I felt the weight of survival turn into strength. The company was safe, not because of chance, but because truth had been chosen over comfort. And in that choice, we found not only stability, but dignity. I did not celebrate when it was all over. There were no glasses raised, no parties thrown in my name. Instead, I chose the quiet of my rose garden, where the late afternoon sun spilled across the petals and the air carried nothing but the scent of peace. I sat there, hands folded loosely in my lap, listening to the rustle of leaves. After months of deceit, betrayal, and public scandal, silence was the only victory I desired. The truth had been dragged into the light, but it had not come without pain. I bore scars no one could see, of a husband's betrayal, of a son's cruel words, of the shame that stained my family name. Justice was never free. It demanded sacrifices, tears, and strength I sometimes thought I no longer had. Yet, as I sat among the roses, I realized that survival itself was proof. Proof that a woman, even at 64, could still fight, endure, and remain unbroken. A letter arrived not long after, its envelope stamped with marks from across the ocean. It was from my daughter. Her words brought tears I had long held back. She wrote of pride, of admiration, of the courage she saw in me. She told me she would never confuse me with the man who had failed her, that she wanted her own children to grow up knowing that a woman's strength was not defined by her husband, but by her own resolve. I held the letter close, as though it could mend the cracks left in my heart. In the end, I had kept what mattered most. My dignity was intact, unbroken by scandal. The company I had built with my own two hands was safe, returned to the vision I had always intended. But beyond the titles, beyond the balance sheets, the greatest victory was reclaiming my own life. For too long I had been overshadowed, dismissed as just a wife, just a mother. Now I was something else. I was the author of my own survival. People think old age means weakness, I thought, watching the sunlight fade over the roses. But age is not fragility. Age is armor, forged by wisdom, sharpened by time. And I was living proof. After the storm had passed, I chose not to linger among the ruins. Instead, I returned to the sea, to the place I had once dreamed of when I was young and restless. The villa by the shore had been mine for decades, bought in those early years when ambition still drove every decision. For so long it had sat unused, a silent witness to the life I built elsewhere. Now, it became my refuge, the place where my heart could finally be still. Each morning I stepped barefoot into the garden, the dew wet against my skin, the roses bowing under the weight of their blossoms. I carried a watering can, moving slowly, carefully, as though each drop I poured was also a prayer. Beyond the flowers, the horizon opened, and the sun rose from the sea in a blaze of light. I would pause there, the warmth on my face, and feel the heaviness of the past drift away like mist over the waves. Afternoons brought a gentler rhythm. I would brew tea in my favorite porcelain set, the same one I had carried through years of moves and storms. I sat on the veranda with a book, the pages turning softly in the ocean breeze. There were no arguments echoing through the halls, no whispers of betrayal lingering in the corners. Only the sound of waves folding against the shore and the faint sweetness of roses drifting on the air. The quiet did not feel empty. It felt earned. For years I had fought battles no one could see, stood against those who should have loved me, and carried the burden of truths too sharp to speak. Now, in the silence, I felt myself restored. Each glance at the vast ocean reminded me that life was larger than any wound, deeper than any betrayal. The sea stretched endlessly, untamed and free, and I too felt unshackled. I was no longer a woman defined by loss or by scandal. I was simply Scarlet, keeper of her roses, reader of her books, companion to the tide. And though my body bore the marks of age, my spirit felt lighter than it had in years. Looking out at the endless horizon, I realized that peace was not given. It was chosen, nurtured, and finally, after all the storms, found. From time to time, my daughter flew back from Europe with her children, and the quiet villa by the sea transformed into a place alive with laughter. The moment their small feet touched the stone pathway of the garden, the silence broke into music. They ran between the rows of roses, their voices chiming like bells, chasing one another until the air itself seemed lighter. I would sit on the veranda, a cup of tea cooling in my hand, watching them as though the years themselves had rolled backward. The house, once filled with echoes of betrayal and arguments, now held the laughter of children bouncing off its walls. Their joy had no agenda, no calculation, no deceit. It was pure, honest, and healing. I did not need boardrooms or titles or the approval of men who had failed me. My heart found its reward here, in the untamed giggles of my grandchildren, in their little hands tugging at my sleeve, urging me to come play. Sometimes my daughter would sit beside me, her eyes soft with understanding. She did not need to say much. In the way she looked at me, I felt her pride, her quiet acknowledgement that I had stood firm when the world tried to strip me bare. Together we watched her children weave through the garden like sunlight darting through leaves. She would lean against my shoulder, and I would think how different this moment was from the cold distance of the past. I no longer searched for recognition from my husband, nor for validation from Ryder. Their approval had once been the center of my life, but no longer. Now my joy was found in the simple, fleeting moments: a child's laughter, a hug around my waist, a whispered, "I love you" from lips still missing their front teeth. In those moments, I felt something far greater than victory. I felt renewal, the sound of children laughing carried through the halls, filling spaces once heavy with silence. It was in their voices that I discovered the proof that life does not end with betrayal, nor does love die with broken trust. The future was not measured in contracts or wealth, but in the warmth of a child's embrace. And though I was deep into the autumn of my life, their joy painted my horizon with spring once more. One quiet afternoon, I sat at the old oak desk in the corner of my seaside villa, the same desk I had owned since my early marriage. Its surface bore scratches from decades of use, but it felt steady beneath my hands. I pulled out a sheet of cream-colored stationery and uncapped a fountain pen, the kind of ritual that always slowed my thoughts and made them honest. This time, I was writing to my dearest friend, a woman who had stood beside me through so many seasons of my life, though oceans now separated us. The words came slowly at first, each one heavy with memory. I wrote of betrayal, not in abstract terms, but with the raw ache of what I had endured. I told her about the nights when the silence of the house nearly suffocated me, when Aidan's absence and Riley's smile had felt like knives cutting through the fabric of my family. I admitted how much it had cost me to keep standing, to fight back when all I wanted was to collapse into grief. Yet, as my pen moved, I felt strength slip into the ink. I reminded her, and perhaps reminded myself, that I had not been destroyed. I wrote, "People think old age means weakness, but in truth, age is a weapon, sharpened by wisdom." The words looked sharp against the page, a declaration drawn from every scar, every lesson that betrayal had carved into me. I continued, not with bitterness, but with clarity. I told her that betrayals are never to be forgiven, not when they come from those who pretend to love. I wrote, "Those who are greedy and deceitful will, sooner or later, pay their price." It was not vengeance speaking, but conviction. I wanted her to know that justice had been served, not just in the courts, but in the hearts of those who had once been blind and now could see. When the letter was finished, I set down my pen and read it once more. It was not only a message to a friend, it was a record of survival, proof that even in my later years, I had the courage to confront what others might have endured in silence. Folding the letter carefully, I sealed it in an envelope, pressing it closed with steady hands. The sea wind drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of roses, and I felt lighter. What I had written was not just a confession, it was a truth carved into me, sent across the distance to remind another woman that strength, even in age, is never lost. I ended the letter with a pause, letting my pen hover before I wrote the final words. I did not offer conclusions, nor dictate lessons. Instead, I left a question on the page, one that had haunted me throughout this journey. Is revenge the true victory, or is peace the greater prize? The ink glistened as it dried, carrying with it the weight of a lifetime, not just the scars of betrayal, but the wisdom of endurance. That evening, I folded the letter and placed it aside. The sun was sinking, spilling fire over the horizon, painting the sea in shades of gold and crimson. I walked into the garden and lowered myself onto the old wooden bench, the roses swaying gently in the ocean breeze. Around me, the world was still, as if it too waited for an answer I could not provide. My eyes, though lined with age, held no bitterness. They were calm, steady, reflecting not vengeance but the clarity of survival. The silence of the moment carried its own kind of truth. I knew that each person who heard my story would find their own meaning. Some might see victory in the public unmasking of those who betrayed me. Others might believe that the greater triumph was simply this: to sit in peace, unbroken, at the close of day. I did not need to decide for them. Justice, after all, is as personal as it is universal. Happiness, too, wears a different face for every soul. As the last light bled into the sea, I felt no need to look back. The past had already given me its lessons, and the future stretched wide and untamed. What remained was the present, this moment, this breath, this quiet garden where I could finally exist without fear. And to those who might listen, to women of my age who have carried burdens in silence, I offer this invitation: tell your story. Speak of what you endured, of what you overcame. Share your truth so that others may know that dignity does not fade with age and wisdom only sharpens with time. Let the world see that older women are not relics of the past, but keepers of strength. For in our voices lies the reminder that justice and self respect are never out of reach.